about is really overhauling our URLs for our abstracts in particular to optimize for SEO. So I want to give a little background for any of you who might not be familiar with how URLs play a role in SEO and really where, and I should go back that for those of you who may not be familiar, SEO is search engine optimization. So the consumption of content and how it is spit out in terms of relevancy by search engines like Google. So when a search engine works in this method, it really derives relevancy from a number of factors. I'll be honest, and I think that most of you are familiar with search know that Google holds this very close to the chest. But there are certain items that each year we're able to glean from how their algorithm works, and a lot of it is really basic in some ways. Clear structure, being able to look and say, this is the path that is on the URL, and it's logical, it makes sense. Shorter, in fact, is better than longer. And the idea behind that is that it is believed that Google will penalize you for trying to essentially pack keywords, and I'll get that to the second, which usually ends up and results in longer URLs. But that being said, strong URLs should also include key terms, and as I just mentioned, but not to overuse. So having a term that is very relevant about what your content is about is a must within the URL. Likewise, it should be representative of the title wherever possible. A lot of URLs, depending upon the size of the title, which are typically much shorter, you will see that the title is essentially the URL itself. You remove the stop words, you add connectors of dashes, and voila, you've got a URL. But at the same time, you want it to be human readable, so that if somebody sees a URL out of context of a title, that they can actually understand what that content itself is going to be about if they decide to click on it. So for us, with this digital transformation, we're looking at everything, and I mean soup to nuts on what we are looking to improve. And one of the first things that we realized was that our abstract structure for URLs did not include keywords. You can see in the example there, it's great for us. Essentially, it's clean. It's got the domain name. It's got the record, which is really what we're referring to. It's got the unique identifier that we use internally for an abstract, and it's got the label of abstract. But we're lacking any key terms in there. So therefore, a human being who looks at that has no idea what it is. They could not tell you what it was they were going to click on. Second piece of that, though, is if we wanted to just take our abstract titles and use those and append those at the end of the record and the unique identifier, and just essentially say insert title with removing stop words, we would have a little bit of a difficulty when we get to that length piece. I'm kind of trying to illustrate here a little bit of what we have from an average length, which is, let's be honest, extremely long. But then when we get into the long, it's really, really long. So the idea of being able to just take a title and use that as a component of the URL was not going to work for us as we look to improve the SEO of our URL structure for abstracts. So in addition, we wanted to develop a new construct and about how that would look. And we knew that it had to still include the ID because that's a reference for us. It's a very important key, and it also adds that element of uniqueness that we need in a URL. Unsurprisingly, many abstracts share the same title because they're submitted year over year and they're looking at the same things, but there's an advancement of the research. So there isn't a change in the title, there's a change in the body. So if we didn't add the ID for uniqueness, we would be in trouble because all the URLs would, well, not all the URLs, but we would have URLs that themselves were not unique, which would just result in an appending of a number at the end of it. So we figured that with including the ID, it would allow us to be able to have that value of uniqueness. But we looked at those titles again and said, there is absolutely no way we can support that length of title. So the idea we had was to come up with a short presentation or meta title that we would be able to extract keywords from and use that within the URL structure. Ultimately, we wanted to limit that to no more than 60 characters. And even then, 60 characters is longer than we would want. However, it's manageable. It works within the scope of it, particularly when looking at the overall length of titles that we have. So that was great on paper, great when we discussed it. But then came the question, how are we actually going to do this? In 2020 alone, we published 7,339 abstracts. First kind of potential answer was, well, we could just ask the authors to create these shorter titles. And then we realized that the authors were, in fact, the ones that created the long titles to begin with. So we had to scratch that off of our list. Next thing was, well, could we go to staff and ask them to rework these titles? And then when I pulled out the 7,339 abstracts number, we all realized that was going to be an impossibility. I'm not even sure, because programmatically, they come in limited time frames. It's not like we have that over the course of a year. At one point before our annual meeting, we will have as many as 5,500 abstracts come in a very short window to have those titles recrafted for the meta title purpose. Another thing that's not on my slide, but we did look into was, well, you know what, could we farm this out? Could we have a team of people that were available at given times, basically contractors to do the work? Kind of didn't want to put that out there. There are a couple reasons. Security is one of them. Another big one was, what happens if they don't complete the work on time? So we found no working magic wand at all. So there was no silver bullet for us to look to. So we had to kind of start going back to the drawing board of rethinking what might be a possibility to do this. So I reached out to Access Innovations with the idea, more of a question actually, which was, could we programmatically generate short titles from our existing content? Meaning ideally from the title itself, but what else do we have? We have the body. What can we do to create something that says, this is what this abstract is about, but not using the length of the title that we'd identified as problematic at the start? Obviously, key to that was identifying those most important terms. How could we extract those and then say, these are the ones that are key for us to include, but still stay under 60 characters? Obviously, realize that taxonomies, by their very nature, contain the most important terms. And for us, when we look at what would be extracted from this, we would want to look at our subjects taxonomy, our drugs taxonomy, our genes taxonomy, and our entities taxonomy. And the entities taxonomy is actually being completely overhauled right now. And within that scope, the most important thing to extract for us would be named clinical trials, because they are often used within the scope of an abstract title, but very importantly, they're key for individuals looking to be able to identify what this research came from. Where did it start from, which would be that named clinical trial. So the solution, it sounds simple, of course, but the devils are always in the details, was to index the titles against taxonomies to extract these keywords. Then we could compose those meta titles from those. So we ran an initial test, working with the folks at Access Innovations. We indexed against all of the taxonomies that I just referenced, as well as MESH. We wanted a comparative factor to see whether we could potentially yield more in terms of value from MESH in combination, if not aside from our taxonomies. First pass, what we found were there really weren't a lot of hits across the ASCO taxonomies. I should be clear on this, that we were just looking at the titles as the source. So that single string of 110, 20, 30, 130 characters, what hits did we have in there? MESH had more hits, but too many of them were very non-relevant, meaning that they were not the most important pieces of the title. They were the secondary terms within that title. One of the, certainly the positives that I think that came out was we started to uncover some missing terms. And these were particularly with regard to patient groups. By that, I mean that if you think of it hierarchically, if you have a parent that would be patient groups, then you'd have demographic characteristics that would live under there. And this is kind of important because a lot of research is geared to target particular patient groups. And it identified a kind of a shortcoming that we had, one that we'll rectify in the future. But it also highlighted some rules that could use some tweaking, meaning that I saw terms within the titles that should have been hits, but weren't. So we're working to go back kind of the drawing board a little bit and see where we could make those tweaks to make sure that those terms are coming based on the rule system within the data harmony. And then, you know, if we're looking at being short, which we are with 60 characters, programmatically, if we do assign a term hit, what we would want to actually display in the meta title was an acronym rather than the preferred term itself. So that was the first test, and basically came to me. I ran through it. I gave my feedback, because obviously this is, like so many things, going to be an iterative process. As we learn, we can adjust. If we learn again, then we can adjust. So the second test came in, and we scrapped mesh completely and ran solely against ASCO taxonomies. But in addition, we also added the body as another source of content. So we were indexing against the body and title, offering a greater weight on the title than the body, but still bringing in a little bit more to try to derive meaning from. Still a somewhat mixed bag of results. We certainly identified more terms, but what I started noticing was that what came out as the meta title used a lot of terms that were in the body, but not actually in the title, which was kind of getting away from what we were trying to do in the first place. And then finally, it's, when we're looking, that then there are key terms that should be there that were not in there because they still were not in the taxonomy, were not being identified via the rules base. So I dug in a little more deeply, I guess, at this point, and tried to provide as much detail as we went back to Access Innovations with those findings, and then got to the third test. And then there were some adjustments made to the logic to be higher on weighted terms. And then even more weighting was added to the term in the title. The output, which was very important, because when we get a return from this, when we ultimately get to the place we want to be, we want to get a return that literally can be stored within our database and then extracted to comprise the XML. So rather than have a title that comes in that, or a subset of a string of terms, we wanted to actually comprise it with the dashes in between it. So we literally can say, append this to this part of the URL to display, and it will be stored within our data repo. Still, unfortunately, we're still seeing some of the low impact terms, and those that are more likely to be found in the body, making it into the meta title. And then again, still seeing existing terms that were not being indexed. And this is, if I look at the title and I know that term is in the taxonomy, it's not making it into the title, and it's not coming through in the indexing. So we're having to look at those rules base again to see why aren't they quite making it in. So that's kind of where we stand. I should note that we started this project in December. So I'm actually very glad that I'm able to present now in as much detail and as many iterations as we have, because it's a pretty short term to kind of have this kind of in-depth work already being accomplished. But just to kind of do an illustration about what I saw when I took a look at what the last batch that we had. If you look at the bottom piece here, which is going to have the title and then the construct of the URL that will come out, the highlighted terms in green are misses that essentially we found exist in the taxonomy and are important enough that they should be in the actual the meta title at the end. As you can see, there are a lot of hits that are in there that we do want in that meta title, but these other ones are quite important. Then there are other ones that also are important that should have been indexed, but they just did not. Oh, excuse me. Let me back up. Yeah, the green highlights are those who existed in the taxonomy, but were not indexed in this test. The yellow highlights were terms that we found that were not in the taxonomy itself. I think it's interesting that one of the pieces I've realized today, in fact, is that the tests we were doing are on content that has not been run against an n-gram yet to be added to the n-gram analysis to be added to the taxonomy. So that very well could be the reason why we're not finding some of these terms, that they will be added when we do our next pass on that, which will be next month. The other piece, though, is the terms that were being pulled in to that meta title that should not be part of that. And so if you look at the strike in the new URL, mutation and PARP1, which were found, I believe, in the body of this, did not rise to the level of making it into the meta title because it's not in the title. I think one of the principles I have on this is, if the author did not feel that that term was important enough to add into the overall too long title, then it shouldn't be included in the meta title. So, like I just said, we're really just getting started. We've done the three iterations. We have kind of in our next steps, we have the path. So we want to experiment with greater de-emphasis on the body indexing, which I think will really come in the form of even boosting perhaps the title a little bit more. So we're starting to align push down those terms that are hits within the body from an overall weighting perspective. Add those new terms that we're finding, many of which I believe will result from an N-gram analysis that we'll be doing in the near future. And certainly building out those patient groups, because that's very important for us to capture within those meta titles. Continue to tweak the existing rules in what we're finding to ensure that those connections found within a title. And I think, it's a good test. It's actually a great process by where we are going back and, constantly updating our rule set to make sure that we're accounting for some outliers. Finally, to keep testing. But I think it's very important that when I look at this project to say that we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of good enough. And really by that, I mean that if we can get to a stage that we feel like we're close, that is much better than what we currently have, which is having a URL that has absolutely no key terms in it at all. So I feel like we're making really good progress. I look forward to where we're going to be headed in the future, and continuing to work with Access Innovations to get there. Thank you all.
Thank you, Travis. Great. Yeah, we've made a lot of progress in just, 2 months on this project. So
yes, I do want to reiterate that it's been a very short time frame for something like this, to actually have the number of iterations that we've had and the progress I've already seen in the results.
Yeah. So one of the questions is, do you have any samples of the results that I think to this?
Yeah, I do. So I don't know if that came in before that second to last slide, which was kind of that example. Anybody that would like to see, I've got, I think 10 or 12 titles mapped out in that same manner, kind of strike through, green, yellow, that I'm happy to share with anybody.
Okay. I'd like to mention at this time that when you are at the table chats during the break, you are able to share your screen if you want to. So it will show up as an additional thumbnail at the table. So for whoever asked that question, you may want to try to track down Travis during the break and see if he's got those willing.
Yeah, I'll have to find those too, but I think I know how to find them.
Okay. And Hongs asks, what do you mean by index title with taxonomy to extract keywords?
Okay. So the idea is, in indexing, we're going to go against a subset of content. In this case, really, it's the idea that the only content that we were starting with as a premise was limited to the title itself. So if I go back and I can just read it on my own slide, what that last title was. So it's a phase 2 trial of PARP inhibitor. I actually wish I hadn't just committed to this since I can't pronounce half of it. But niraparib in BAP1 and other DNA damage response pathway deficient neoplasms, including cholangiocarcinoma. Maybe not as bad as I thought. So the idea is to take that, index that against those 4 taxonomies that we've referenced, identify what are the key terms within that. So in this case, what we found was PARP inhibitor, niraparib, biliary system cancer, DNA damage, cholangiocarcinoma, and pathway deficient neoplasms. Everything rose to that level in that long title. So it's the idea of being able to identify what is key based upon our taxonomical structures.
Okay. Chris asked, do you also analyze some of the terms against Google keyword trends?
Not against Google keyword trends, because most of the engagement that we can get, I feel like the most access to is actually the keywords used on our sites. So which goes into our taxonomical development. We do refine that. That's part of the N-gram analysis we do a couple times a year. And I always want to bring search terms into that so that we can see what is being searched. Because a lot of times it points out to key terms that we may have missed or not accounted for. And if people are looking for them, typically what I'll do is see if there is any content, which sometimes there isn't. But if there is, then we want to make sure those are added. So really, best information we have is how people search on our site, knowing that they're going to use the same pattern search in a in an external search like a Google.
Okay. Good. Robert says, brilliant. Once you refine this to a point where you're happy with results, would you consider helping authors with titles on submission and possibly gathering feedback from authors and reviewers?
Yeah, I think that one of the thoughts that we had kicked around a little bit is the idea of producing the meta title for them to take a look at. And it's a risk because we don't want it to expand, but perhaps they would identify something that wasn't necessary. So I think the primary concern that we would have is the ability of explaining the concept and what it was being used for to an author at the point of submission. And I think that would require a little bit of testing to make sure that what we were producing and the instructions that were associated with it were clear enough that they understood this isn't, because I fear that if we use the word, if we throughout the phrase key terms, it could end up being another 130 character string of terms. So I think we would need to do some experimentation, but having them as an editorial resource on that, I think would be helpful. Perhaps if we looked at an implementation that only allowed for excising, not increasing, and perhaps cutting rather than expanding, which would be the only way I would see an implementation that might work on that.
Interesting. So some good ideas for moving forward on those next steps. That is all the questions we have at the moment. So thank you very much, Travis. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.